In the summer of 2018, I went to Madagascar for 2 weeks. I first arrived to the airport in Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar, or known by everyone there as Tana. On my way to Madagascar, I was reading some books and decided that I wanted to go to see this Tsingy rock structure in the west. And so I went straight to a hostel and tried to arrange a trip to go there. And the hostel set me up with this guy who was going to take a trip leaving the next day. This park is particularly difficult to reach and can only be reached by tourists for 6 months of the year. It's not accessible by public transportation, so you have to catch a driver who has a car with four-wheel drive. It is, however, also accessible by a boat trip where you travel down the Tsiribihina River for 2.5 to 3 days and camp along the riverside as you go. I opted to take the boat trip, and I left early the next morning with a guy that I had met the night before, and we traveled by taxi brousse, the local form of public transportation, to a city called Tsiribihina, where the other travelers were already waiting. When I finally made it to Tsiribihina, I was transported from my taxi brousse by rickshaw to a private car. The guy that I had met the night before, who I mistakenly thought was my guide, left me with the other travelers that I would be going on the trip with. After we all met, we sat around and waited for what felt like a really long time, and then we finally left and set off to the next city, which was supposedly close to the entrance of the river, where we would be beginning our journey the next day. This day was the first day that I heard that there were some bandits going around in this part of Madagascar as Independence Day was coming up, and the river was first opening up for tourists. We were getting a bit nervous as we were driving through the night, but we finally reached our hotel. We were set to leave at 6 o'clock in the morning, and it turns out that someone else had been added to our trip overnight. We then traveled the rest of the way to the entrance of the river, and we were immediately greeted by many, many, many children.
Ya, a fondo con el balón. Very good.
We had some breakfast in the village, picked up some boatmen and some boats, and then the children walked with us to say goodbye as we set off on the boats. We put all of our things into wooden pirogue boats, where we would be living the next 2.5 days. And we set off, 2 people plus 1 paddler per boat. Shortly after we set off, we found a boat that would be the only other tourist boat that we would see the entire time on the river, which was stuck in the river, and we had to stop and help them get unstuck. What everyone had failed to mention was that this river was infested with crocodiles, and it wasn't even 1 hour down the river before we saw our first crocodile. It wasn't long after that I lost count of how many crocodiles we saw. As the afternoon came, we came across a small inlet that had a magnificent waterfall and many, many, many lemurs that we got to watch this guy feed. After we left here, we didn't travel much further down the river before we stopped and set up camp, and our guide and the paddlers cooked dinner for us. Slowly, some children started to show up seemingly out of nowhere, and we invited them to eat with us. After we ate, the boatman and our guide started to play music, and slowly more and more people started to appear seemingly out of nowhere, and they sung and danced with us late into the night. We woke up and breakfast was already prepared for us, and we saw some of the children from the night before in the distance, and we invited them to come over and help us finish the breakfast. And then we set off and started our first full day on the river. We stopped in a small village to pick up some more food, and we quickly became best friends with all of the children who were excited to show us around their village. Stopped a bit earlier than we thought we had planned, and we sat around in this inlet off of the river for what seemed like a few hours. We didn't really know what was going on, but it turned out that they were getting some more news about the bandits who were in this area just a few days before. So we decided that we weren't going to travel for very much longer today, and we stopped shortly after this and set up camp nearby this inlet that we stopped at. Independence Day was just a few days away, and we could hear parties going on throughout the night. And when we woke up in the morning, we could still hear the parties. As we set up on our last day on the river, we found that in the night before, the zebu that were going to take our bags had been stolen by bandits. These are zebus, a type of cattle that are found in Madagascar, but unfortunately not ours. Our river trip ended here, and we had to sit around for quite some time as we waited to figure out how we would now get the rest of our things to the next city where we would be staying. Finally, Unfortunately, something had been worked out behind the scenes, and a driver picked us up to take us to the next city called Belo. And there we would be staying in a hotel where we would have our first shower after a few days of living on the river. As you can see here, the roads on this trip were incredibly bad, with potholes bigger than I'd ever seen in my life. We spent the night in Belo, and the next day we had to wait for a military caravan to take all of the tourists to the entrance of the park. This took a very long time to assemble, and we had to wait for a few hours for everyone to get there, but it was best that we all traveled together because of the bandits in the area, who, mind you, had already stolen all of our zebu. To finally get to the park entrance, we had to cross over a river with a ferry. Since we were traveling in a military caravan, we had to wait for everyone to take their turn to cross on the ferry. I'm not really sure what's going on here, but along the way we saw a lot of forest on fire like this, and we drove on top of it. We then had to cross another river, where we had to wait again a very long time for our turn on the ferry. But when we finally made it across the river, everyone else made it to their hotels and we made it to our campsite where we would be spending the night.
Vas-y, je vais monter parce qu'il y a de l'eau.
morning, our guide woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning to travel to the park entrance to get us an English-speaking guide and some hiking equipment that we would need for the trek. Thankfully, he did this because it's not uncommon that they run out of necessary hiking equipment. We started our day off at the Grand Tsingy, which was a short hike in the forest and quickly turned into a climb. Malagasy word which loosely translates to where one cannot walk, and it is basically a word for these special type of rocks that you see here. then headed back to the campsite where we would have lunch and hang out with the children until our guide came back to take us to the Petite Tsingy.
이쁘게. 카메라.
The Petite Tsingy hike took substantially less time than the Grand Tsingy, but was just as spectacular. Our guide pointed out this cave which supposedly has remnants from ancient humans. We then spent one more night camping at the campsite and hanging out with the locals until we left the next morning to head back to Bello, the town that we'd been a few nights before. Once we made it to Bello, we continued on to Morondava, where we thought we would all be separating. And along the way, we stopped to see the Allee of Baobabs. Just as everyone says, it's shorter than you would have imagined. However, some of these trees have been here for over 1,000 years and are just magnificent. We then finished our trip to Morondava, where we saw the first ATM that we'd seen in over a week. All of us were almost out of money, and we begged the driver to stop there so that we could pick some more up. We then arranged for a taxi brousse to pick us all up and take us all back to Antietam Bay the next morning. The taxi brousse to Antietam Bay picked us up from the hotel around 3:30 in the morning, and then we had to drive around and pick up all of the other passengers before we could set off. I'd not yet worked out my plans for the next week that I had in Madagascar, and on the way to Antietam Bay, I planned with two of the girls that I met on the trip to go to continue on with them to the north. It actually took us a very long time to figure out our plans and solidify, but we decided to continue on to Tana overnight. And then we were going to try and pick up a new driver to take us to the north, but we were unable to do this, and instead, in a split-second decision, we decided to pick another taxi brousse to take us to Diego Suarez. The trip ended up taking 28.5 hours. After our first taxi brousse, we had to switch to another one for some reason, and this was perhaps the most uncomfortable car ride I've ever been on my life, and we at one time had probably about 30 people packed into one car that was meant for about 16 people. Finally though, after about 28 hours, we made it to the last taxi brousse station in Diego Suarez, and we picked up our last taxi, which only took 1 more hour to get to our hotel in Diego Suarez, which was on the stunning Emerald Sea. Over dinner the night before in the hotel, we arranged for a trip the next morning to go to some uninhabited islands off the coast of the Emerald Sea by boat. After about an hour of sailing, we finally reached the island, and we had lunch there and hung out on the beach for a few hours. Suddenly, around 2 o'clock, everyone who was on the island for the day decided to sail back, and we quickly realized why, as the waters were quite rough on the way back. That night in our hotel, we were able to arrange for a driver who was going to pick us up for a decent price the next morning and take us to some national parks. Even though the hotel swore to us that the driver spoke English, it was quickly apparent to us that he only spoke a bit of French. And we set off running his errands on the way to the first park that we wanted to go to, Mountain d'Ambre. And for quite some time we weren't really sure where we were going because of the fact that we couldn't communicate with our driver. Eventually, we finally made it to Mountain d'Ambre, where we quickly ran into tons of wildlife. guide at Mountain de Ambre thankfully spoke English and helped us work out our details of the trip with our driver. And we thought that he was taking us to Tsingy Rouge, but as we traveled into the night, we were getting more and more uncomfortable with the darkness and knowing that we had just had to try to maneuver around all of these bandits in the west. But finally we ended up staying at some bungalows that were pretty close to the entrance of Tsingy Rouge. As promised, the next morning we woke up and set off to Tsingy Rouge, and our driver stopped to show us some beautiful landscapes along the way. When we made it to this part of Tsingy Rouge, we all agreed that we felt like we were on another planet. We spent just a few hours at Tsingy Rouge, and we then headed on to the next park, Ankarana. I didn't have much time left, so I decided I was only going to do one hike here before I headed back to Tana.
Vai, Bora o cara ver?
For a driver to take me to the nearest city where I could pick up a taxi brousse back to Tana. I also asked him to take me to find a bank or an ATM because I had run out of money again because of how difficult it is to come across currency here. Unfortunately, I was unable to find any working ATM here, so I had to trade the last 50 euros that I had for Ariari. This left me with just enough money to pay the driver, pay for my taxi brousse back to Tana, and have just enough money left to get a taxi back to the ATM that I knew that worked in Tana, which means that I was unable to buy any food the entire rest of the way back to Tana.